Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here, and I'm so excited that you're joining me for part 6 of Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this segment, I'm going to show you my favorite part of the quilting process, the machine quilting. I'm just doing it on a regular home sewing machine, but you could also do it on a long arm if you wanted to. Now, before I quilt any quilt, I make what I call a quilting plan. This is a diagram or a suggestion, or maybe a roadmap, if you will, of how I'm going to get from point A to point B across the quilt. The important thing about a quilting plan is you can absolutely deviate from the plan, but it just helps you stay anchored and know how you're going to quilt the quilt. Now you can use the quilting plan that I include in the quilt pattern, or you can follow the video I'm going to show you on how I quilted this one behind me. Or if you want to change things up, you can check out any of the machine quilting ideas from my books or my patterns. Anything you choose is going to look fun. So let's dive in and get started. So the first thing I always do is make a quilting plan. For the original version of Blooming Wallflowers, I made a block plan showing which motifs will go where. First, I used ruler work to quilt straight lines and a chevron motif inside the darker triangles. I should really call them straight-ish because I'm not worried about if they're perfectly straight. I'm using a specialty foot and ruler to quilt all of the darker triangles in one pass. I decided to add some random flourishes in between each of the chevron lines just to give it a little something extra. As you can see, these designs are somewhat random and irregular to quilt, but they sure are fun. After quilting all of the darker triangles, I quilted pebbles in the lighter triangles. I was able to quilt all of the triangle blocks without cutting thread. I worked my way around one triangle and then moved to the next triangle where the triangle points meet. This way I'm able to quilt the entire Blooming Wallflowers block with just one start and stop each time. This is the back side of the quilt where you can see how it looks after being stitched out. After quilting all of the blocks, I quilted the background with the navy blue thread, but you can't really see it that much, so it's a great place to practice a new design, like my jagged stipple. Now, isn't that a cool way to quilt using rulers? For the next segment, I'm going to show you the quilting plan that I did on Blooming Wallflowers without the use of any rulers or specialty equipment. All I'm using is the free motion foot to fit my machine. Be sure to grab a copy of my books, 99 Machine Quilting Designs, or The Ultimate Guide to Machine Quilting for loads of ideas on different quilting motifs that you can stitch on this quilt. For this version of Blooming Wallflowers, I'm going to quilt 3 different motifs: stipple in the background, continuous curves in the lighter triangles, and rainbow in the darker triangles. But first, let's talk about the overall quilting approach. I'm going to start quilting on the right-hand side of my quilt, and I will fill in the entire first column of blocks with my chosen motifs. These lines just represent the rough area I plan to cover, not the actual quilting design. Then I'm going to quilt the second column in a similar manner. So at this point, I'm going to rotate the quilt and start roughly in the middle where I left off last time. Then I'll quilt the third column of blocks to finish it off. This is a rough idea of the pathway I'll take to quilt my way all the way across the quilt. Now I've zoomed in on the image to show how I'm going to quilt each set of triangle blocks in a continuous pathway. Once I meander my way to each block, I'll start quilting continuous curves. To make it continuous, I'll quilt the arc that's at the bottom of each triangle, then return to the starting point. Next, I'll quilt the remaining 2 arcs in each triangle, bouncing around the block as I go. You can always quilt another set of continuous curves inside of the first set. When I quilt, I'm going to use the same thread color throughout. I'm just changing ink colors as I draw to make the pathway more obvious. Next, I'll quilt a free motion design inside the darker triangle blocks. I'm meandering my way around the entire triangle, one at a time. I'm going to stitch a rainbow motif, and this is my rough sketch of that design. The actual quilting might look quite different, but this gives me a rough idea of where I'm going. Whenever the triangle tips touch, that's how I can pass from one triangle to the next without cutting thread in between. So to make my quilting plan, all I do is take a printout of what the design is, and then I just draw on top of it with a dark marker. You can do something similar by taking a photograph of your quilt top and then printing it off in black and white. Or if you have the PDF version of the quilt pattern, you can just enlarge it and print off as many copies as you need. Sometimes it takes me several ideas until I come up with a quilting plan that I like. Now that you've seen the detailed block quilting plan for blooming wallflowers, let me show you how I incorporate that plan into the overall quilting design. Remember, the way I'm doing this is it helps me make my way all the way across the quilt with the fewest starts and stops. I'll start my overall plan in the upper right corner of the quilt. I'm going to meander stipple my way around as much of the background fabric as I can. Now what I'm drawing out is not the exact same thing that I'll be quilting. The density and the scale may be different, but this gives me an idea of how I'm going to move around the quilt from point to point. Remember, any place where the same fabric touches means you can meander into and out of the area without cutting thread. So I'm stippling as much of the background fabric as I can. Then when I get to the first block, I'll pause and begin quilting the block quilting plan that I showed you before. Again, changing colors as I draw helps you follow the plan, but the entire design is going to be quilted with only one thread color. I'm drawing continuous curves in the triangles, and I don't need to draw in all the detail. This is just a reminder to me so that I know what goes where. I can decide how dense the continuous curves will be once I get to the real quilt. I can also decide to quilt the curve on the bottom of each triangle first or last, depending on how I'm feeling when I get there. I can also decide which of the dark triangles I want to quilt first, how to meander my way around each triangle, and how densely I want to quilt the design. These are all decisions I'm going to make as I'm quilting the quilt and as I'm moving and rotating the quilt, so the whole process is a lot easier. Once I stipple my way to the next set of triangle blocks, I'll repeat the sequence. Well, now that you've seen my quilting plan, let me show you how I translate that to the actual quilt. In many cases, I may deviate from how I actually drew it on the plan, but that's okay. As long as I cover the entire quilt, it's really good. And again, you can deviate from the plan anytime you like. So here you can see me quilting the stipple design, starting in the upper right-hand corner of the quilt according to my quilting plan. Right now, I'm stitching at actual speed, and I'm wiggling my way around the quilt to form rounded bumps as I move. I'm using a free motion foot that fits my machine, and my feed dogs are dropped. You can use a stitch regulator if you like, but I learned how to quilt without one, so it's kind of what I'm used to. The open toe of the foot allows me better visibility while stitching. I'm also wearing quilting gloves because they help me grip the quilt so that I can move around in a smooth, fluid movement. Now I'm going to speed up that video a little bit. I'll meander my way around the background area until I reach the first block unit to quilt. To keep the quilting continuous, I'll stitch continuous curves in the lighter triangle blocks next. I'm not at all worried about perfection here. This quilt is so busy that you won't notice any wobbles or bobbles as you stitch. It's all about adding fun texture to the quilt. Right now, I'm stitching at actual speed so you can see how I try to keep everything smooth as I work my way around the block. I'm going from point to point, stitching a gently curving line. Now you do not have to hit each point exactly, and you may miss the points entirely when you add more lines. That's perfectly okay. The important thing is to keep the design flowing all the way around the block. So I'm quilting the outside curves first before I stitch the middles. You can really do it in any order or stitch it up as long as you keep moving in the same direction. Notice how often I stop and reposition my hands. I only quilt a little bit at a time before I need to move my hands to another position. Anytime you start to reach or your quilt doesn't feel flat and smooth, stop and readjust so that there's no friction slowing you down. You can make the bed of your machine slicker with a Teflon sheet called a Supreme Slider that clings to your machine while free motion quilting. Once the outside curves are stitched, I'll close the design by stitching the inner curves that will end up making a circle around the block. Now I'll repeat that design one more time to make double continuous curves. You can keep going and quilt a third round of curves, or you can fill in the middle of the triangles with another design if you want to. But I didn't worry about doing that. I just left my centers unquilted. See how I can keep going continuously? The only reason I would stop is if I run out of thread. Fortunately, this fabric is busy enough that any starts and stops won't be very noticeable. Now I'm filling in the background areas with more stippling as I complete each block. Sometimes I'll quilt this area first, and sometimes I'll quilt it in between the two triangle designs. There's no wrong way to do it as long as all of the spaces get filled in with quilting. And remember, the best way to hide imperfect quilting is to add more stitching. Next, I'm quilting rainbows or crescent shapes in the darker triangle blocks. This adds a really nice texture to the quilt. Again, it's going to be hard to see the stitching detail because of this busy fabric, so it's a fun quilting motif to practice, knowing that you can mess up and it's still going to look good. I can quilt the rainbows in all directions. I can quilt them in any size. I can echo and go back and forth as many times as I want to. Just try to fill in the entire area around the triangle while you figure out where you're going to go next. Once those darker triangles have been quilted, I'll fill in any remaining background fabric using that stipple motif again. So here's what it looks like from the wider view of my sewing machine. I'm using my Christa Cabinet to hold up the weight of the quilt. This is a wonderful piece of furniture I designed with arrow sewing cabinets specifically for domestic machine quilting. It has a drop-in area so that the machine is flush with the tabletop, and I have a custom insert that fits right around my machine. There's lots of room around the machine to scrunch and smooth out the quilt. There's also an extra leaf near the front of the table that extends off to my left, forming an L shape. This helps completely hold up the weight of the quilt while I move it around. There's also some room off to my right to hold my notions and scissors and other things so they don't fall off on the ground. When I quilt, I create peaks and valleys within the quilt. I scrunch up the bulk all around me, forming some bigger peaks. Then the area right in front of me where I'm actually stitching is the smooth valley. Here's another view from the other side of the machine so you can see how I smooth out those valleys as I go. I'm only quilting the area in between my hands, so my hands sort of act like a hoop or a frame around the area I'm quilting. As long as there's no friction or drag on the area I'm quilting, I can get nice, smooth stitches as I quilt. So I've quilted this quilt starting from the right-hand side of the quilt and moving all the way towards the center. Just be careful when the foot gets to the edge of your quilt that it doesn't slip underneath the quilt top. The little bit of batting and backing sticking out gives me something to grip when I'm actually quilting near the edges of the quilt. Now that I've quilted about half of the quilt, it's time to rotate it. So I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position on the quilt, then scrunch, smush, and rotate the entire quilt under the machine. This is where having 10 inches of throat space on my BERNINA really comes in handy. Here's another close-up where you can really see how fun the variegated thread looks on my black, white, and bright fabric collection. I'm continuing to repeat the quilting plan all the way across the quilt. Stipple in the background, curves in the light triangles, and dense rainbows in the darker triangles. If I see that my bobbin is getting low, I'm going to stitch off the edge of the quilt and put in a fresh bobbin. But if something happens and the needle were to break or I'd run out of thread, all I would have to do is pull out a little bit of the thread, tie it off, and keep going. Or I could just stitch right on top of a previous line of stitching, and it's not going to be that noticeable. Trust me, by the time you quilt an entire quilt with these motifs, you'll be an expert at that design. These actually stitch up pretty quickly, and it only took me a couple of hours to quilt this entire quilt. So here is a close-up of the finished stitched quilt. You can really see how those fun motifs add texture to the quilt. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. Just remember, when it comes to machine quilting, don't get hung up on perfection. I like to call myself a perfectly imperfect quilter. And I sure hope as you make your quilt, you'll share it with me on social media. Be sure to hashtag Blooming Wallflowers Quilt and tag me at Christa Quilts. I can't tell you how much it makes my day when I see what you're working on. I want to be your cheerleader so that you have as much fun making this quilt as I do. Don't forget to check out the description box below with links to all the information you need to make this quilt and get the supplies. Happy sewing!